So everybody should be looking at my screen. Just a quick confirmation from anyone that you can
You're
see.
up and running?
All right, perfect. Okay. All right, so as Bernie mentioned, I run global sales and marketing and strategy for Identity. Now, as we settle into what we hope are the last stages of this pandemic, we can certainly remember that the world was very different than it was a year and a half ago. One thing that hasn't changed, though, is the way that we authenticate. Now, having said that, for the next 30 minutes or so, I want you to imagine a world without passwords. Now, we use passwords several times a day, but I'm sure few of us have ever thought about why we should not use them or how that would even be possible. Now, most of you have influence over technology choices, and I hope you're going to come away with a different mindset when you decide on future authentication solutions. Now, I founded Identity over 2 years ago, along with a team of experts that share this passion for doing things right. And as Bernie mentioned, we believe that authentication should be simple and secure for everyone, and most importantly, without passwords. So what do we have on tap for today? Now, before diving into best practices for passwordless authentication, I want to start the discussion on the importance of the user experience and how passwords have actually become a liability to your organization. Now, after that, I want to share some key capabilities that are necessary to make passwordless authentication simple and secure. I will also offer some tips on how an organization can transition to passwordless authentication with minimal friction. And for your reference, a copy of this presentation will be made available. I think Bernie has it, and I'm sure he'll be able to distribute that to you. Now, included in your copy of the presentation is actually a link to a YouTube video playlist that we've compiled of passwordless authentication use cases that you can view later. Now, we're going to end today's presentation with some Q&A. Now, as we go along, I'm sure questions are going to pop into your head. So let's use the chat window, post it to everyone. So whatever question comes to mind, post it in the chat window at any time. We'll get to those questions at the end of the session. All right. Now for those history buffs out there. Did you know that there's a guy by the name of Fernando Corbato who is responsible for inventing the password? He did this back in 1960, okay? So with all the rapid advances in technology, it's hard to believe, but we're still primarily using something that's 60 years old. Now, before his passing last year, he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And he says to the Wall Street Journal, unfortunately, it's become kind of a nightmare with the World Wide Web. I don't think anybody can possibly remember all the passwords that we should set up. That leaves people with two choices. Now, either you maintain a crib sheet, which is, a mild no-no, or you use some sort of program as a password manager. Now, either one of these is a nuisance. Well, there actually is a third choice, and it's time to drop the password. Now, that's what we're here to discuss today. But first, I think we need to look at why the password is such a problem. Now, let's begin with something everyone will agree on. Users don't like passwords. Actually, according to one study, the average user has 191 passwords to remember. Now, I only have around 50 to 60, but even one is too many. Now, how many passwords do you have? Do you favor long random strings or longer simple passphrases? To make things more secure, would you rather implement an authentication policy that uses the same 30-character password or execute 3 simple factors of authentication for every site? Now, the famous psychologist George Miller, his lifelong study of human cognitive science found that the typical person can remember up to 7 digits. Now, people with exceptional memories can remember 9. Now, this doesn't include letters or characters. Now, my mother-in-law, she's got this nice book next to her computer so that she and any unwanted visitors in her house can easily look up a site's password. Now, if you make your passwords longer and require characters and letters, they become even more difficult to remember. In fact, 73% of respondents to a recent study consider that forgetting passwords is the most frustrating aspect of account security. Now, there's several products whose main job is just to keep track of your many passwords, but users have to learn how to use these products, and in many cases, well, they have to pay for them. Now, some studies show that stringent password rules lower an organization's risk of breaches when compared to using more simple passwords. Now, I really question that study because stronger passwords introduce friction, and users will find a way to reduce that friction. It's probably by pasting a sticky note with the password under their keyboard, or worse, right on the monitor. Now, many times the password policies aren't even presented to the user during registration. So the user is forced into this trial and error to get a password that works. Now, my wife, she's a super nice lady and everyone likes her. But you ask her to create a new password and she is swearing like a drunken sailor. Now, whether you choose a long, complex string of characters or longer, simpler passphrases, strong passwords are difficult to create. Let's not forget that it's not only recalling the password, but it's the difficulty in typing them consistently, especially on your mobile device. Now, there are password managers, and yeah, Apple has the keychain, but you still have to type it correctly at least twice during registration. Well, it's clear why chief digital officers are laser focused on that user experience. Now, contributing to this, did you know that a third of all shopping carts are abandoned due to forgotten passwords? Think about the revenue that's sitting there. And bad user experience is causing companies to lose revenue. Now, here's one example. If someone is looking for health insurance online, as you know, in the US, we have choices down here. And if they have a bad experience, they're going to go elsewhere to buy. And according to one survey, this actually equates to the average premium of single coverage is around $6,400 a year. And the average premium for family coverage is around 18 grand a year. So just 50 to 100 customers can account for $1 million either won or lost. Now, people want products and systems to meet their needs that are easy and pleasant to use and that are well made. This ease of use and design quality have become selling points for companies like Apple and Amazon, Intuit, and others. And the results of these improvements are impressive. When you look at Bank of America, they redesigned their registration process and were able to get registration up by 45%. American Eagle Outfitters, they increased their sales by 53% after launching a redesigned website. And clothing retailer Anthropologie increased their sales by 24% just with a user experience redesign that made its checkout process easier. Now, Microsoft, get this. So they did some research on their search engine, Bing, and they found that the link color didn't project a feeling of confidence. So they changed this color to a bolder blue. And they estimated that it generated at least 80 million in additional advertising revenue. Think about that, just a shade of blue. And another consulting firm doing some user research on a site that had poor sales on their mobile app, they found that it was because the buy button was something the users didn't notice and they had a hard time clicking. So they added additional buy buttons throughout the process, generated an additional 500 million per year. Now, is there a particular site you've encountered that wins the worst user experience award? Well, I'm sure that some of those come to mind pretty quickly. And I bet a lot of the friction that you had on that site had to do with registration and authentication. You see, this user experience is $1 trillion problem, and registration and authentication has a huge impact. Why? Well, it's the first thing that users see. Now, during the first few months of the pandemic, much of the world was under this stay-at-home directive. And there was also brief shortages of popular items. We know what they are. Just so you know, in the United States, we had a shortage of toilet paper as well. And, this really pushed a lot of consumers to online shopping. In fact, online sales increased 55% in July of 2020 compared to the year before. Digital banking was off the charts during this pandemic. Digital banking usage among the larger banks increased to 72%. And we also saw an 81% increase in the dollar value of deposits in April of 2020 compared to the year before. Delivery services for food and other items increased. In fact, Apptopia's data showed new records for Instacart, Walmart Grocery, ShipT, Target, triple-digit growth. Now, a lot of the state and local websites were seeing a lot more traffic because, quite frankly, the offices were closed and they had to do a lot of their business online. Now, believe it or not, there were over 5.2 billion website visits over the past 90 days of all the public websites. And more patients are interacting with patient portals. And in the US, our CMS has actually granted payment parity between telehealth and in-person clinical care for Medicare, which has spurred even more patient portal activity. We see telemedicine like eCare 21, it's just booming off the charts. And it's estimated that telemedicine services are actually going to grow sevenfold by 2025. So businesses have gone through major transformations. Now, they're adding delivery and curbside pickup. I used to see 1 or 2 parking spaces reserved for pickup, and now I see half an aisle dedicated to it, and they're usually full. And some research suggests that this increase in online service is actually here to stay. Now, when you look at the headlines, once every few days, there's a major brand in the news that's addressing some data breach. 80% of the data breaches involve stolen credentials. And studies are now showing the financial impact that are long after the actual breach. 31% of consumers surveyed, they say they discontinued their relationship with the company that had a data breach. And of those consumers affected by 1 or more breaches, 65% say they lost trust in that breached organization. We've seen stock prices drop an average of 5% when a data breach is disclosed. And 71% of chief marketing officers believe that the cost of a security incident is actually the loss of brand value. Now to set the stage for the attack surface at work. Now, did you know that 1/3 of workers don't care about their password, which obviously makes securing the enterprise even tougher? But the most alarming statistic for me as a security professional was learning that 53% of workers use the same password for work and home. And we know that home networks do not have sophisticated IDPs and firewalls. And IT departments just don't have the funding to employ tools to mandate stronger security. But the business must stay open. So with workers at home, how are they connecting to the enterprise? Well, a lot of it's usually through a VPN or remote desktop protocol. And each of these have their own issues with deployment of vulnerabilities. Now, with the increase in the VPN usage, obviously with more people working from home, these password resets have been on the rise. In fact, a joint US DHS CISA and UK National Cybersecurity Center alert actually outlined one method called vishing with a V. See, hackers know that these VPN passwords are being delivered by voicemail. So they launch campaigns to hack into these voicemails to steal those passwords. Now, remote desktop protocol, very popular, allows users to get their entire workspace just as they would see it at work. It has its own set of vulnerabilities. Brute force hacking, believe it or not, where you can just run username and password until you get in. That's a problem. But actually, many of the remote desktop protocol passwords, they're actually sold on the dark web. So having said that, there's also this issue where COVID is contributing to a number of the cyber attacks. See, criminals like to use our fear against us. And in doing so, they're going to initiate a lot of social engineering attacks that basically just trick people into giving those cyber attackers access. So posing as a fellow employee or an employee of a vendor or partner company or auditor as a new employee requesting help, pretending to be from a remote office and asking for email access locally as someone in authority. They're asking, they might actually pose as a system manufacturer offering some system update or patch. You see, all of these schemes have exponentially added to the cybersecurity risk. And many studies are indicating that many of those that have moved to work from home, well, they're likely there to stay. Now, sure, there's going to be future pandemics and local outbreaks that are, these are going to drive companies to keep as many people working remotely as possible in order to keep the business going. Now, at the end of the day, though, remember, the IT security professional has to be right 100% of the time. But a hacker, well, they only have to be right once. Now, while consumers have changed their behavior because of COVID, there's also been a big spike in cyber threats to users at work. And hackers are often using these current world events to make their scams more effective. And cyber criminals have launched several campaigns that have been identified by cybersecurity companies. And the bottom line is that cyber criminals basically attempt to exploit our concerns about the COVID-19 outbreak for their own criminal end. Now, worse yet, cyber criminals actually targeted the supply chain and delivery of the vaccines that were rolling out. Now, this was uncovered by some IBM cybersecurity researchers, and the researchers concluded in their report that companies in the supply chain were phished for their credentials, which were likely used to gain access to confidential data. Now, Google, they've been identifying more than 240 million COVID-related spam messages per day, and that it had actually detected 18 million phishing and malware emails a day related to the pandemic. And overall, Gmail blocks more than 100 million phishing emails each day. Now, some common COVID scams and phishing techniques include tricking consumers to click on malicious links using tax relief and government-issued stimulus plans, tricking consumers to download documents labeled as COVID safety precautions. They're duping consumers into clicking links from emails, offering the updated list of new COVID cases in the area. Phishing attacks, soliciting donations to fight the spread of coronavirus by imitating organizations like CDC and the Red Cross. We see fraudulent e-commerce still today for mass sanitizers and test kits. And not a direct scam, but it's certainly related. There's been a massive increase in coronavirus-themed domain registrations that are going to be used for later phishing attempts. Now, we're not just talking about digital identities being compromised. This actually impacts our national security. If you recall last summer, the southeastern US was crippled when ransomware hit a little-known company called Colonial Pipeline. Turns out this pipeline is how people get their gasoline distributed throughout the southeastern United States. The result was long lines to gas stations all over, and this was all over the world news. Now, this was caused by a breach of a VPN password, which was not protected by any form of multi-factor authentication. Unbelievable. And then there is, of course, the recent state-sponsored breach that some are calling the breach of the century, and this is due to its scope and magnitude. This is the SolarWinds breach. Now, this actually started with the breach of a password to a system that pushes updates to millions of servers all over the world, including those at Microsoft. The password to this system, I can't make this up, SolarWinds123. Now, of course, everyone's been critical of having such a simple password to a critical infrastructure system, saying that, SolarWinds could have done better by having a stronger password. And this breach is going to impact the world for months, maybe years to come. But what if we were not using passwords for authentication? What if there were at least 3 factors of authentication without passwords that was not vulnerable to impersonation? See, all these attacks are after one thing, the password. You hear a lot about this advanced persistent threat, or APT as it's known in security circles. Well, we argue that it's not so advanced because you can just ask people for their password, but it is persistent. And we need to remove the burden of security from the end user. In a moment, we're going to discuss how we can put technology to work to protect people from doing stupid things and, of course, make the world more secure. So it's clear, passwords have to go. Now, many of the current solutions are cumbersome. Users aren't going to buy in if the process is difficult or time-consuming. And businesses generally aren't going to invest in a solution that frustrates their customers or their workers. But unfortunately, hackers aren't going anywhere. So businesses are left juggling customer satisfaction or security. And what we have today isn't simple or cost-effective either. We can't sacrifice security for ease of use. So to drive adoption, a solution has to be both simple and secure. Now, let's look at some key capabilities a passwordless authentication tool should have. The primary authentication, maybe we should try using something that 3.3 billion of us already have in our hands and is never far away, our smartphones. There's so much computing power in our mobile devices. Most come with built-in biometrics, and that actually adds another factor of authentication. And there should also be alternate methods, such as using other devices like our PC or Mac. But honestly, most users are going to want to use their mobile devices. The goal is to eliminate the password, but we still need to make sure that the authentication is simple and secure. Now, whether you're a consumer or worker, registering should be simple. For consumers, you should have the option of just tapping a social ID to eliminate typing a username. The social identity API shouldn't ask for an OAuth token, which is a very popular thing to do, that basically turns it into use your social credentials for authentication. You should only ask for the attribute that uniquely identifies the user, again, to eliminate typing. Employees will typically authenticate initially with their intranet credentials when they're registering. And this also validates their identity. Now, you need to make use of the QR code when you're registering folks for passwordless authentication. QR codes are so handy, and they can basically instruct mobile devices to essentially go to app stores and actually go right to apps, as opposed to just telling users, hey, you can find us on the App Store. Yeah, my mother-in-law tries that, and she fails 2 out of 3 times. She installs the wrong app. And when you do that, you've lost them. Now, let's go ahead and log in the user after registration. No need to force them to go through the login process after registering. I see so many multi-factor tools that actually do this. They make you go through the little circus again. And why do that? You're never going to be as sure the user is who they say they are then at that moment. And privacy is important. You need to make sure that you store as little, if no, PII on consumers. Just need a username or something unique to bind and register the account. Then, of course, organizations are going to want the ability to request additional fields if necessary. But ultimately, you need to allow the user to choose what's saved and what's not, so that you make regulatory compliance like GDPR easy. Okay, so registration's easy. What about account management? Remember, people are going to register for multiple accounts. So while we're eliminating passwords, we should also eliminate remembering usernames. So your authentication app should keep track of usernames inside it, so users don't have to, right? Displaying the usernames linked to each account that the users create on the homepage of the mobile application. This is handy, so that in case they forget what their username was, they'll have it on the particular app. Now, they should be able to modify not only their username, but other details about their account without having to work through tech support and those kinds of things. And then finally, backups. You need to have a way for the user to back up all those credentials and easily restore them, whether because they're going to lose their phone or they're going to upgrade. And people don't always stay with Apple. If they start out with Apple, they may switch to Android. So the restore has got to be able to be platform independent. With registrations of self-care covered, what about authentication? Well, the core tenet, you need to keep it simple. Okay, users simply accept or deny with a single gesture to perform multi-factor authentication. Okay, put technology to work. This increases usability and security. And of course, make use of that device biometric. It's pretty good, and it's actually something the user's already conditioned for. And instead of forcing users to remember and frantically type digits as the clock ticks down, think SMS OTP, use comparison for single glance assurance. See, when we use comparison to authenticate, it's faster and less error prone. So what would you compare? Well, the authenticating server should send something that lets the user and the authenticating app know that it's a legitimate server. Now, this eliminates fake websites and those man-in-the-middle attacks. Now, some companies are actually trying to utilize artificial intelligence. You've probably heard this, where they sort of keep a history on what you do and how you move your mouse or how you swipe your phone or whatever. Now, artificial intelligence, when it's configured correctly, it's still a pain. But when it's configured poorly, it can be a nightmare for your end users. So here's a tip. If the authentication is simple and secure enough for everyone, you really don't need the hassle of false positives and negatives that AI is going to generate. Now, on the employee side, the enrollment might be slightly different than the consumer registration. First and foremost, integration into an existing identity management or user provisioning tool is obviously a must for employee authentication. Now, with the expansion of the remote workforce, the need for convenient and secure enrollment options for those systems is growing. And employees need the ability to register from home without having to come into the office, right? It defeats the purpose. Or contact the help desk or administrators, or worse yet, leaving your credentials right on the PBX system. Many organizations also have a need for more granular control. So group registration should allow provisioning tools or administrators to send invitation links to a group of employees, maybe based on some unique rights and permissions. And from time to time, visitors such as guests and vendors are going to need access to corporate resources. So the ability to grant access on a temporary and time restricted basis is going to help keep those organizational resources secure while providing the necessary access and maintaining business continuity. Now, let's look at integrating passwordless authentication to the enterprise. Now, with respect to enterprise integration, you have to consider where most of the workers will be working from. It's either going to be a Windows or a Mac OS desktop. And passwordless authentication tool should have native clients for both, right? You're going to need that option. This allows for integrating into the desktop unlock facility, which is a major pain for employees when that particular password is forgotten, and native biometrics that support additional factors such as YubiKey hardware tokens or even other means. Now, with the increasing incidence of these COVID-related social engineering attacks that we talked about earlier and the growing remote workforce, there is the need to maintain a secure connection to the workplace. And of course, VPNs are very popular. The good news is that they support this thing called the Radius protocol. And it's been around for almost 20 years. The secure Radius protocol can be coupled with strong two-factor authentication to protect against that unauthorized access to critical corporate data, as was the case with Colonial Pipeline, all while reducing the management effort and cutting costs. Now, we know SMS is costly because every time you send one of those out, there's a cost associated with it, but it's insecure, right? Hackers can easily just ask people for that SMS OTP and get in. Instead of manually entering a time-based code, the user can simply look at a couple of pictures and press a confirmation, and they're signed in. And with the prevalence of third-party cloud applications, your Workdays, your Salesforce, and all these cloud services that are out there, even Office 365, single sign-on is a must for business entities. You see, with single sign-on, and I'm sure you've heard of the term, users authenticate only once to access multiple web apps. But these single sign-on tools, base implementation is actually just to have one password, which is one too many. Now, by acting as an identity provider, the passwordless authentication tool can perform the authentication first, and then let the SSO tool pass the user on to all the applications that are registered. And of course, if there isn't an SSO tool, the passwordless authentication tool can support full SSO. Now, some businesses are more complex. You see, single sign-on is usually an outbound authentication initiated by an identity provider, which is usually the enterprise to access the service, which is the target application. There may also be a need to support incoming authentication from partners like suppliers and dealers and such. And of course, in the federated model, you're trusting that those people that are coming in have been properly vetted and authenticated by their enterprise. But you might want to trust but verify. So why not have those partners perform a couple of extra factors of authentication? It would take less than a second, eliminating the risk of impersonation. See, all the capabilities and techniques we've discussed so far really focus on simplicity. Let's make the authentication more secure. Now, remembering the basics of multi-factor authentication, there are 3 distinct types: something you know, something you have, and something you are. Now, using 2 methods such as password and SMS OTP or email, they're really 2 of the first type. It's going to be something that the user knows. The most secure authentication will utilize all three types of authentication. Now, before we get into understanding, how best to address authentication, we need to understand what's out there. The passwordless, the password authentication model, which is the standard, really requires the secret to be kept in two places. The first is some central repository, and the other is in the memory of a human. Now, the central password repository is actually synonymous with a bank vault in that you're keeping something valuable away from those with bad intentions. Well, why do criminals rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why do hackers crack into password vaults? That's where all the passwords are. Now, of course, banks are likely to invest more in the security of the money vault than they do in protecting the password vault. But in spite of how diligent an organization is in securing the enterprise, there are just too many ways that hackers get in. Misconfiguration, compromise employees, etc. And humans, well, we're supposed to keep the password known only to us, but humans like to share secrets, and worse yet, we can be tricked into giving up our password. Just send us a legitimate email that looks like it's from someone we do business with and ask us for that password. Okay, not everyone will fall for those types of phishing attacks, but you know what? A surprising number will. And one study found that 43% of users fell for an email with the subject line, password check required. And if you guys recall, in the 2016 elections, the entire course of history changed because John Podesta was tricked with exactly this type of social engineering attack with his email account. Now, when you consider that since humans choose their password so they can remember it, the sheer number of different passwords forces them to reuse that password. And that means that if a hacker phishes someone for the password, this is likely used at other common sites. Same with the case where a password vault is breached. These passwords have likely been used at other sites. So no matter how secure your password vault is, to eliminate fraud, you have to hope that other sites are as secure as yours and that all users use different strong passwords on every site. Good luck with that. Now, looking at another trending method, obviously there's this push to go without passwords. And the most popular method that we see these days of, I'll put this in quotation marks, passwordless authentication, is the use of OAuth tokens that are granted by APIs in social networks. Essentially, what you're doing is you ask a user to authenticate to their social network and prompt the user to grant the authenticator permission to use a secure token, which the social network will grant to the actual device that's being used. Now, this has to be repeated each time the user comes in from a different device or browser. It's not ideal, but hey, we got rid of the password, didn't we? Well, the issues go far beyond having to register each device or browser. You see, we know social accounts are easily taken over by hackers using fake websites, so asking them to provide their social identity credentials. And hackers can easily create an account on behalf of the user. However, the real user is that the tokens that are granted are simply one-way authentication. There's no verification that the website asking for the token is valid. So just like passwords, users can be tricked into initiating authentication and giving up those tokens. And when passwordless user experience is mistaken for passwordless security, everyone's going to pay the price. So we need to break that trend. First step, decentralized authentication. Okay, move the keys from the central server or vault to the user. Now, this enables true passwordless security. Rather than storing hundreds, thousands, millions of passwords in a single repository, users' credentials are decentralized and stored safely in the advanced trusted environment on the user's personal devices. This approach removes the hacker's primary target, the vault, and renders credential stuffing attacks infeasible. And shrinking your attack surface is never a bad idea. But let's not stop there. Here's a term to become familiar with: full duplex authentication. Now, this is something Identity has a trademark and a patent, and we believe it's essential to securing the token-based passwordless authentication. You see, users providing their token credentials without checking the service provider's authenticity can lead to those credentials being intercepted and used to impersonate the user. So before the user authenticates to the service, make the service authenticate to the user using full duplex authentication, thereby essentially eliminating impersonation on either end. Decentralized authentication based on FIDO standards means that certificates in lieu of passwords that never leave the user's device and are never stored on the server. When you enhance this with full duplex authentication, we virtually eliminated the risk of phishing, all forms of password theft, and replay attacks. Nothing for the user to share, and impersonation is off the table. Now, these all come together to enable NIST Authenticator Assurance Level 3 compliant, which says must not be vulnerable to impersonation. Now, let's deconstruct multi-factor authentication as we know it, put it back together in a way that's simple and secure. Remember, the most secure authentication will involve all three types: something you know, something you have, and something you are. And many authenticators strengthen the password process by adding to it. But why not just eliminate the password? There's no need for it, right? Passwords are familiar, and Fernando's invention was groundbreaking, but so were Walkmans. Just because it was a good idea then doesn't mean we need it now. Now let's get rid of all the headaches caused by passwords by simply simplifying registration, authentication, and increasing security in one fell swoop. And don't settle for social identity OAuth tokens. A lot of sites do this. As we mentioned, they can be phished. And most of today's multi-factor authentication solutions are still only using two factors, password plus something else. We need to use true three-factor authentication and include the use of biometrics, arguably one of the stronger factors. Users can quickly and securely authenticate with zero typing actions by the user. And we need to ditch those patently insecure SMS and OAuth token methods and replace it with full duplex push-based authentication. And while you're at it, you can tie up a few loose ends by adding some context-based authentication. So you can do things like geofencing. Have they come in with this particular browser before? Is this a particular pattern that we've seen? The result should be that the user needs to execute these three factors of authentication with just a look, a click, or a tap. You see, we're conditioned for change, and we generally like things the way they are. With your help, we can, obviously we can ditch the password paradigm, and we can solve a number of other issues too. So I want to take you through this slide deck and just show you the slide where you can find our playlist, and then we'll wrap up and go to questions here shortly. So just to summarize, when you look at the benefits of passwordless authentication, with the improvements in the user experience, particularly eliminating the friction associated with passwords, enterprises are going to be able to gain more online customers and retain their existing one. The result is going to be increased revenue. Workers, they're going to be much more productive. Think about it, not having to change your password every 90 days, right? The security gets much stronger for the enterprise and the online user. See, without a password to steal, this is going to significantly reduce your cyber attack surface. And by keeping a minimum of 3 factors of authentication in use, we're finally going to get ahead of these cyber criminals. And the peace of mind that users will have by not carrying around something that everyone wants to steal is going to make us all feel safer. So before I play this video, I want you to recall what we talked about. If there are any questions, again, post those through the chat window. As soon as the video ends, we'll go ahead and take those questions.
Workers have trouble with passwords. They can't remember them, and work stops when they have to reset them. Passwords are really easy to steal. It's time we finally get rid of the password. At Identity, we believe authentication should be simple, secure, and without passwords. By implementing NoPass, users will have a simple registration process. Returning users will use 3 types of authentication factors: something they know, which is their username; something they have, which is a secure token on the phone. This process is not vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks or impersonation because it uses full duplex authentication. The server must authenticate to the Authenticator app before proceeding to the next factor. The third type of authentication factor will be a biometric. All 3 factors of authentication are performed in just a few seconds. Workers need to be able to work from home, but they don't have the security built around them at home as they do at work. Workers can also benefit from single sign-on. They can sign on once to the employee portal and quickly open up other applications to perform their duties. NoPass can also perform authorization checks in addition to authentication. Implementation is simple. Connect your applications to the NoPass server and go passwordless today. The risk of a data breach due to a stolen password is eliminated because there is no longer a password. The improved user experience will increase productivity because your worker spends less time recovering a password and more time conducting business.
All right, well, thanks for spending some time with us. I know you're really busy. Just a couple of questions for you before we go. If there's a particular group of users you could see some immediate benefits for, or if there are any projects in the future with you see this as a good fit, please contact us at